Bismihi tabaraka wa ta'ala. In His name, blessed and exalted. This is, on the surface, an easy thing to talk about, but if one wants to be faithful to the length and breadth of the Islamic tradition, it becomes a little complicated. My remarks today are very selective. I don't intend to go through the whole outline of what the paper was assigned to us. I want to say some remarks about the Quran, which is of fundamental importance for the rest of Islamic tradition and intellectual expression, and also some remarks about ethics. And I might preface that by saying my presentation would be better entitled "The Practice of Good," because conceptualizing it is something that some Muslims did do, especially those who were philosophically inclined. But most Muslims, in their daily life and in their religious expression, didn't think too much about the conceptualization, but attended to the practice of the idea of good and virtue and the avoidance of its opposite, however we want to characterize that. So, starting with the Quranic data, give me a warning at 5 minutes before the end of it. We have, of course, the word khair, good, and it's a very major term. If you look in the lexicon, you'll find that it's one of the most widely used terms in the Quran. And the parallel term derived from the root is khairat, which is the plural of khaira, which means a good work, a good deed, a good act. It's not the only term for good act or good deed in the Quran, but it's one of the most widely employed. And certainly, this is something that is heavily emphasized. On the other hand, another very useful and widely used term is derived from the root salah, sulh, which means uprightness, integrity, goodness, and the form of it as a act of beneficial use for humans is sulha. Salihat is the plural. So we have this constant refrain in the Quran. Whoever believes and performs good works, amala salihat, and this is drubbed in over and over again. The Quran mediates its message and its attempt at persuasion through repetition and through constant returning to the theme over and over again until it becomes a habitual awareness in the person who uses the Quran as their main scripture or avenue to God, if you will. So, and the other aspect of the Quran, which we have to recognize because its nature as scripture is different from the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, which have a narrative and chronological framework. They tell you a story, they start from the beginning and they go to the end of it, whereas the Quran starts in the middle. And it comes to the beginning and it comes to the end and it goes back to the middle, over and over again. So you get immersed in it. It's like a carpet, the weaving, the arabesque pattern. Where does it start? Where does it end? There is no start and end. There's just the following through the pattern, right? And so this allows the consciousness that originated the Quran. Of course, Muslims sincerely believe that it is the word of God, revealed through the Prophet Muhammad, so that there's no question about a man being involved. Other people might have different ways of explaining the revealed text of the Quran, is that there is a conscious effort to conceal important messages in the constant repetition. In philosophical concept, it's known as tabdil al-ilm, the dispersal, the scattering of knowledge, so that if you constantly reacquaint yourself with the text and the different accounts of the same event, which sometimes are the same, but sometimes introduce new details, then if you carefully compare and consider and weigh critically, something is given to you, an insight, and that this requires an effort on your part in order to unpack or unravel that. It's a very important aspect of the Quran. Most people today don't read the Quran like that. They make it out into a sacramental recitation. The power and the beauty of the language alone satisfies them, and they use it in their daily ritual without much pondering or reflection on the meaning, which is unfortunate, unfortunately. Let me give you an example. If you take the story of Adam and Iblis, God and the devil, Diabolos, Iblis, and it's recounted in the Quran in at least 5 different chapters in slightly differing detail. And the same basic frame story is given. The question being, when God was about to create Iblis, the devil was there, God was about to create Adam, he announced to the angels, we're going to create a successor on the earth who will take charge of the earth and inhabit it. And the angels complained or asked God, they said, do you want to create a creature who will shed blood and spread corruption on the earth? And God argued back to the angels that I have knowledge about this creature that you don't possess. And it goes on in detail. And then he commanded the angels to prostrate to Adam, to bow to Adam. And they all did except this one angel, question mark, Iblis, who said, I am better than him. You created me from fire. You created him from clay, and you created me from fire. So therefore, fire is superior to clay. So I refuse to humble myself to a handiwork of yours that is of an inferior make, so to speak. And for that reason, he was expelled from paradise, or in the company of the angels. There are different arguments about whether Iblis truly belonged among the angels, or whether he was always a devil, or belonged to the jinn. He's the father of the jinn. But in this, following the tale of this in the Quran, you see that there's a dialogue between God and the devil. And God said to him, you have not obeyed me, so you are unworthy to be here in this lofty, elevated place. And the devil said, but since you have misled me, since you have caused me to go astray, then I will now cause humans to go astray and mislead them. And until the day when they are resurrected. And God said, try your best. My true servants and the true worshippers will not be misled by you. But you might have success with some of them, and I'll fill hell with all of you. Now there's a compact made here between God and the devil. God allows the devil to do his work in history. And God must have known beforehand, after all, he's all-knowing and all-powerful, that this creature, this devil, this Iblis, would not obey him and would be expelled. So this opens the door to this question about the origin of evil, whether it was already anticipated or allowed for by the exalted, blessed be he. And so this is one of the factors that if you read all the differing accounts in the Quran and you compare them with each other, this kind of insight might emerge to the reflective and critical mind. It might cause you to wonder, but why did God allow him to do that? Couldn't he have made all the angels bow to Adam? And from then on you can take some understanding about why the devil is the enemy of the human, not of God. He's not necessarily opposed to God. This is not a dualistic system. Dualism was well known in the early Muslim era. The Manichaeans, the Zoroastrians, they had a very convincing dualistic solution to the problem of evil. All good comes from God. Anything evil is not from God. Actually, there were some Muslims who were inclined to that view as well. So if we look at the Quran, we are led to go further than the surface text. And in the first part of my paper, I tried to do that. And I show that khayr, of course, is a fundamental term, and that the doing of good works is a constant refrain. Salihat, khayrat. There is also the notion of good or optimum in the term hasan or husna. And that's contrasted with the word for badness or evil, say'ah. And so we have hasanat and sayyat also. And then there is another major term which has to do with performance of the right and the beneficial and the good, which is the term from the root arafa, to know, to recognize. Ma'ruf, and we were just mentioning now the book by Michael Cook, Commanding the Right and Forbidding the Wrong. This is a fundamental axiom for the Muslims, that one of the imperatives for the faithful is to enjoin the good and to uphold the good, and to, at the same time, forbid and not permit the reprehensible or the deviant or the wrong. And so you can't do one without the other. That's why I was suggesting that practice of good is a more relevant way of approaching, at least for the mainstream of Islamic experience. And there are other terms. I just want to point out in particular one basic notion of these terms. If we take the word sulh, which means conciliation, peace, peacemaking, if you will, and its opposite, we come to a very interesting insight. Sulh, which is a very positive and beneficial good, is the antonym of fasad, corruption and disorder. That's what the angels were complaining about, that humans would spread fasad in the earth, which, by the way, they've continued to do in great intensity. And the muslih, the one who implements and does the sulh, the peacemaking, is the opposite of the mufsid, the one who does the corruption. These are the active participle of the verb. So the hypocrites are questioned by God in the Quran. God says, when it is said to them, the hypocrites, create not disorder in the land, la tufsidu fil ard, they reply, we are only promoters of peace, muslihun. We're not doing anything bad. A rather disingenuous reply. So the mufsid is one who instigates the fasad, corruption among others, who seeks to make mischief, disorder, injustice, to exceed the proper bounds. And in a way, this can be said to be one of the chief characteristics of the good, to stay within the proper bounds, to observe the limits naturally arising within the created order. To exceed proper bounds is objectively an evil or a sin. So, fasad, of course, includes bloodshed and violence as among the most grievous forms of corruption in the earth. And this leads us to the association of this negative term, fasad, with another important negative term, israf, from the verb sarifa, to waste, to overuse, to squander material goods. And the Quran is very clear about this, and if you study through this method of tabdil, you find the dispersed parts and put them together, then it becomes clear to you that corruption and bloodshed arise from wrong use of material resources. Israf, waste, consumption, which is an issue for us today, of course. That's one of the things that's leading to the ecological degradation of our environment, right? So these are all implanted in the Quran and can be derived from it. But we want to go on in a general sense and try to find some useful lessons to be derived from the Islamic experience. And we have this Quranic message has been reinforced in hadith, the narrated reports of the deeds and the actions of the Prophet. May God bless him and overwhelm him in peace. There is an important legal aspect to these lessons that we can derive. The jurists have developed them in some detail in their evaluation of acts. Juristic understanding of the good was done through a classification of acts and their moral weight or probity. So we have 5 different classes of acts. Here it's a kind of ethical reflection in the legal context. The knowledge of this classification category allows us to locate a particular act on a predefined scale of categories. And these start from the least offensive to the most grievous. We have, of course, the act which is good or beneficial, hasan. as opposed to something kabih, ugly or reprehensible. We have something which is wajib, obligatory on us. We cannot avoid doing it. For example, the required ritual performances of our faith, prayer, fasting, etc. These are something that an observant Muslim is not supposed to ignore, right? Then we get something which is recommended. It's not necessary to do it. It's not required, but it's good if you do it. It's not obligatory, but it's recommended. It's mandub or mustahab. Then we get something which is more or less neutral, mubah, permissible. There's no moral judgment about it. Some people would say, for example, that anal sex is mubah. Other people would say, no, it's makruh, offensive. That's the next degree of the scale of categories. We're going towards the negative side now. As far as I know, the Prophet did not encourage this act. Makruh is something disapproved of, which could be done without imperiling your salvational status, but it's not recommended. And then, of course, the last and final category, which is rather categorical, is haram. It's forbidden. It's prohibited. For example, drinking alcohol is considered haram. Despite the fact that many Muslims actually drink alcohol, at least in private, it's not considered something that would lead to your salvational efficacy in the hereafter. So evaluating an action has also to do with evaluating your mode of existence, your lifestyle. Living a good life, therefore, you can always weigh this detailed scale of legal activities by the content of the act, where it fits in. You would have some idea that this act won't harm my salvational status, or it might hurt it, but without a decisive impact, or it might actually prevent me from having a good result in the hereafter. Everything is done in the here and now with the intense consciousness of the consequences of our acts in the hereafter, which of course our modern scientific worldview doesn't recognize. When your body dies, all your thoughts, feelings, emotions, understandings, experiences disappear. You have no lasting existence after the death of the corporal form. Whereas, of course, in the past, among people of faith, that was never accepted, and there was the acceptance that our physical existence has a non-physical, immaterial, spiritual reality, which is of utmost importance to us. And we have the chance now, here and now, in our bodies, to try to assure the best possible outcome, to have the good be part of our existence in the hereafter. So this is a legal aspect. There is also, of course, a very important ethical development. And here I want to quote a few texts, if I will. Very basic psychoanthropology referred to by Rabbi Feldman previously, two impulses. There was anonymous narration says that one of the wise, whoever he was, a sage, was asked, command us with a comprehensive rule of life that will assure our salvation. He said, listen, every person has two forces in them, two ruling forces. One is for the good and one is for the bad. The one for the good is your intelligence. The one for the bad is your appetite, shahwa, or your desire, your inclination. And they are warring over your soul. You are in the middle. And so if you listen to one and he leads you to this direction, then the other one gets weaker and weaker and eventually loses any impact over your life, or vice versa. So you have to pay attention to which of these forces you give credence to and allow to have the most weight in your experience. Now, this is an interesting way of characterizing the good force as intelligence. Aql. Shahwa, appetite, is neutral. The sages recognize that shahwa in itself is a natural function. Islam is not against sex, for example, not against business and commerce, I'm not against enjoying a good meal, but without wine, of course. The indulgence of one's appetite is a healthy thing, but in moderation. And here again, the stress is always on a balance. You can indulge, you can partake of your corporal pleasures, but not to live your life only for satisfying your corporal pleasures. There are other things about your life that you have to satisfy. So this is the basic outline of a system of psychomachia, war in the soul. There's a struggle. You have your angel here, and you have your devil here. They're whispering into your ear, they're trying to lead you to the good or to divert you towards the bad, right? Whichever one of them you give most weight to will become the predominant force in your life. According to some Muslims, at the close of the canonical prayers, the prayer act, one says, turning to the right hand, Assalamu alaikum, and turning to the left, Wassalamu alaikum. You give a salutation to a force on your right and to the force on the left. They say, why is this? We say, you have your angelic force, and you have your satanic force. And you have to recognize that they're there with you. The whole person includes them, right? Although there was an exception. The Prophet instructed his followers, when you talk to me, you don't use the plural. You say, Salamu alayka, singular masculine. Not Salamu alaykum, plural. Why? He said, my devil I conquered, and it's not part of my being. So I'm only good. So when you recognize me, you address me as a unified being, one person. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The akhlaq, the character traits, that's how ethics is referred to in Islamic tradition. It's not ethics as a conceptual field of activity in itself. It's a series of virtues, of good traits, which one tries to emulate and instill in one's being as a habit. In the beginning, it might be an ideal. I would like to be generous, but my instinct is to be miserly and not to give anything to anyone. So if a beggar approaches me, my instinct is, leave me alone, go away. But maybe I should force myself to give him something because that's the required ideal. And eventually, if I do this and overcome this harmful trait of my character, I can instill a better trait, which is generosity and liberality and munificence. And that would be to my credit and would give me a benefit and a good in the hereafter. So, among the many aspects of the science of akhlaq, a very highly developed discipline from an early period is this listing of traits, very much like the Decalogue and Exodus in the Old Testament. And some people say that the Mosaic Decalogue goes back to tribal ethics. I think it was Alexander Alt who first developed that idea in some detail. And here we have a number of listings of traits, always 10, sometimes 12, duodecalogue, in which the main virtuous acts and characteristics of the Muslim are emphasized. The most early one, which is very close to old Arab tribal ethics, which Islam built on, is attributed to the wife of the Prophet Aisha. The eminent traits of character are 10. Speaking the truth, firm courage, giving to the suppliant, repaying good deeds, observing the bonds of blood kinship, returning deposits entrusted to one for safekeeping, dealing with respect and honor towards one's neighbors, dealing honorably with friends, and the chief of them all, the most important one is organic shame, hayat, or you could say modesty or pudency. Organic shame is not something that's practiced much anymore, especially in our modern era, but the idea of averting the gaze from something that's not wholesome, okay? Keeping your energy away from that and not feeding your energy with it. If you go through the type of ways that this very basic listing of 10 traits kind of give you a kind of summary of what a good Muslim should be like. These are the traits that they should try to encourage and implant in themselves as habitual acts. They become much more religiously oriented and in some cases much more spiritualized. This is the way that the early ethical tradition unfolded. Here is one that is attributed to a pre-Islamic sage named Luqman, who is quoted in the Quran in the chapter called Luqman. He was a kind of Aesopic figure, but he was of South Arabian location. Luqman counsels his son. This is from a very early text, Hikmat Luqman, from Wahb ibn Munabbih, who died at the end of the 1st century. He says, "My dear boy, God is not worshipped by anything more surpassing than intelligence, or reason, if you will. A man's intelligence is not completed until there are 10 traits within him. He is immune from haughtiness, pride, arrogance. Maturity is expected of him, wise conduct. He obtains only provision from this world. He is modest in his needs. He is not wasteful and greedy for more. He freely expends his surplus wealth. He's generous with things that are not necessary for his own well-being. Humility is dearer to him than glory. He's not boastful and tries to draw attention to himself. Meek abasement is dearer to him than might. He does not weary from seeking knowledge his whole lifetime." Of course, that's an admirable trait, especially in the Islamic context. "He does not grow weary from people requiring necessities from him. He helps people when they can. He deems a little good from others as excessive, and deems trifling much good done towards others from himself." Self-abnegation. And the 10th trait is that by which his splendor prevails and his intelligence becomes perfected. He sees that all the people are better than him, and that he is the worst of them. Rather, it is as if he sees people to be either one of two men: a man better than him and superior, and a man worse than him and inferior. So he humbles himself to both men. When he sees the one better than him and superior, he wishes to follow him. And when he sees the one worse than him and inferior, he says to himself, "It may be that this one will be saved, and I shall perish. And it may be that the virtue of this man is hidden within and not apparent, and that it is better for him, while his outward manifestation is perceptible, and that is an evil for me," meaning to judge him as worse, because you don't know the true inner character of the person. With this final trait, says Luqman, he perfects his intelligence and becomes the chief of the people of his time, meaning the leading spiritual authority. Of course, this is a very widespread early saying, which you find in many, many forms. And there is a special development of this genre. I have written a special paper about Islamic decalogues, which has examined this and the parallels to the Mosaic Decalogue, which are basically an ethical instruction. So the ethical theories of the later thinkers were more varied and sophisticated. They had imbibed Hellenistic sources of knowledge. They knew about Aristotelian ethics. They understand the analysis of the psychology of acts, which medical experience and other traditions, including Indian and Syrian and North African and Greek, allowed them to extend their own perceptions and theorizing. And most of all, they were very careful to scrutinize themselves and to include their own understanding and experience gained from that scrutiny into their theorizing. So theorizing was never something that was done apart from practice. And that's why if we talk about the cognitive aspect of ethics, we always have to remember that there was a conative dimension, an aspect of conation, willing, volitional. And so that if you know something is good, but you don't do it, that itself is objectively an evil. And those people who know the good, who understand the necessity for the good, but don't practice it, are judged much more harshly than those people who do the good because they understand the need for doing the good. That's a higher state for the human. This is, of course, having to do with the basic understanding of reward and punishment, which has been interiorized. And the Mu'tazilites were among the foremost theorists who took this understanding of action to some special development which outstripped other Muslim schools. They have an analysis, for example, in their zeal to defend God's oneness and his unity and his justice. They have to deal with the problem of human choice and the necessity for humans to have a free choice, but then to also be responsible for their deeds. Because if you are to freely choose, you'll have to answer to the charge that you chose wrongly, or that despite knowing what you should choose, you decided not to choose that, or you ignored that, which is a more serious situation. And so in the debate that went on from the end of the 1st century in this land until at least the 6th or 7th century, talking about the 8th to the 12th century of our common era, there was a great concentration on questions about suffering and pain, especially in the human context, even also involving the animal context. Suffering imposed on animals. Mistreatment of animals is a serious issue when it comes to you have the free choice and how you behave and conduct yourself, and in that context you have to not only take into account the motivations and the conduct of your own acts, but also your impact on others, especially even non-sentient beings such as animals, who have some kind of existence that is different from the rational soul of humans. And we have 5 minutes, okay, thank you. So there are, of course, in aspects of the dialogue in Islam between theology and philosophy, Karim and falsafa, which is a very fertile field. And the dialogue or the back and forth between people who were concerned primarily with defending doctrine and expounding correct belief, the mutakallimun, or the theologians, and those people who are more inclined towards a rational approach, or even a supra-rational approach. Not all philosophers were logicians, by the way, and some of them were interested in an experiential, transcendental experience as well, which they could then unpack perhaps in a conceptual and rational form, or attempt to, whether they were able to or not. And this aspect of Islamic civilization is extremely rich with insights into what the good is, and how to embody the good and to perform the good and to achieve the good as far as possible in our material existence on the earth. And they elaborated, in fact, a model, the dialogue between religious theology and philosophy, a model of the universe which helped the emergence of the modern worldview in 17th century Europe. This has been shown very interestingly by a Singaporean physicist in his book, Dialogue of Civilizations in the Birth of Modern Science, Arun Bala. And that this has fed into our own contemporary scientific worldview. There are other aspects of the topic that I would have liked to have mentioned, however briefly, including Al-Ghazali, the famous Muslim theological and philosophical mind, who opined many centuries before Leibniz that this was the most perfect world that could ever be created, the best of all possible worlds that could have come into existence, despite the obvious existence of suffering, pain, injustice, natural calamities, etc. And he defended it thoroughly. There was a discussion for several centuries over this doctrine of his, and some people who supported it and other people who attacked it. And it's a very interesting chapter. It's been studied by Eric Ormsby in his famous work on the legacy of Ghazali. And it's interesting that he had a kind of anticipation, if you will, of Leibniz, who made a similar argument in Europe in the 17th century. So with that, despite all the inadequacies of my presentation, I thank you for your attention, and I wish all of you well. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.